My parents gave everything to my brother. Then they came begging. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 31 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado, a city surrounded by mountains, wide skies, and the quiet determination of people who work hard to build stable lives. When I look back at my childhood, the memories that stand out the most are not about dramatic events or major arguments, but about a quiet pattern that shaped the way my family functioned. My younger brother Jason was always the center of attention in our house, and although many families naturally give extra care to younger children, the difference in how we were treated often felt impossible to ignore. From a very early age, Jason seemed to receive encouragement, praise, and opportunities that were rarely offered to me. When he succeeded in school, my parents celebrated loudly, talking about his future and the potential they believed he had. When I achieved something similar, the reaction was usually calm and brief, as if my accomplishments were simply expected rather than something worth celebrating. At first, I tried not to think about it too deeply because as a child you often assume your family understands what is best, and you adapt to the roles that develop around you. I became the responsible one, the child who finished homework early, helped around the house, and rarely asked for anything extra, while Jason grew comfortable with the role of someone who could rely on support whenever he needed it. As the years passed, that difference in treatment slowly expanded into other parts of our lives. When we reached high school, my parents invested time and money into activities that Jason enjoyed, including sports equipment, training programs, and trips related to his interests. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs to pay for many of my own expenses, including small things like school supplies, clothes, and transportation. At the time, I convinced myself that the arrangement made sense because I had always been independent and capable of managing responsibilities. However, the imbalance became more obvious whenever decisions about the future were discussed. Jason often spoke about business ideas and big plans that sounded exciting but lacked clear direction, and each time my parents reacted with enthusiasm, telling him they believed he would achieve great success someday. When I talked about my own goals, such as building a career through education and careful planning, the conversations usually ended quickly because my path seemed predictable and less dramatic. After graduating from high school, I focused on earning scholarships and working extra hours so I could attend college without placing additional financial pressure on the family. During that period, Jason explored different interests without much urgency about what he truly wanted to do next. My parents continued supporting him both emotionally and financially, explaining that everyone needs time to discover their purpose. While I respected the idea of giving someone space to grow, it was difficult not to notice how differently we were treated whenever responsibilities appeared. If I faced a challenge, the expectation was that I would solve it independently, but when Jason struggled, my parents stepped in, immediately offering advice, money, or new opportunities. The years after college followed a similar pattern. I started building my career slowly, working long hours, learning new skills, and saving carefully so I could create a stable future for myself. The process required patience, but I valued the independence it gave me. Meanwhile, Jason continued receiving help from our parents, who believed strongly in his potential to succeed through the various ideas he pursued. Sometimes they described him as someone destined for bigger achievements than ordinary careers, and hearing those words always left me wondering why my steady efforts seemed less important, simply because they were quieter and more predictable. The moment that truly revealed how deep their favoritism had become happened several years later. During a conversation about family finances, my parents announced that they had decided to transfer a large portion of their savings and property into Jason's control because they believed he would use those resources to build something extraordinary. They described the decision with pride, explaining that supporting his ambitions was the best investment they could make in the future of the family. Listening to that announcement felt like watching the final confirmation of a story that had been unfolding for most of my life. The brother who had always received more freedom and Encouragement was now being given almost everything, while the daughter who had built her path through effort and patience simply stood there realizing that the imbalance I had quietly accepted for years had just reached a level that would change the direction of our family forever after my parents made the decision to give Jason control over most of their savings and property. The atmosphere in the family slowly changed in ways that became impossible to ignore. At first, they spoke with excitement about the opportunities he would create and the success they believed was waiting for him. Jason also carried a new confidence that came from knowing he had access to resources most people his age never receive. He began talking about different business ideas, investments, and ambitious projects that sounded impressive when described but rarely included detailed plans or careful preparation. Meanwhile, I continued focusing on my own life in Denver, working long hours, learning new skills, and slowly building financial stability through patience and discipline. From time to time, I heard updates from relatives about how Jason was using the money our parents had trusted him with. Sometimes he invested in ventures that promised quick success, and other times he simply spent freely, enjoying the lifestyle that came with having financial support without strict limits. My parents rarely questioned his choices. Whenever concerns were raised, they defended him by explaining that success requires risk and that great achievements often begin with bold decisions. While they spoke proudly about Jason opportunities, their attitude toward my independence remained strangely critical. When I mentioned promotions at work or the progress I was making in my career, they responded with polite but distant reactions, occasionally suggesting that I should relax more or enjoy life instead of focusing so much on stability. Those comments confused me because the discipline they seemed to dismiss was exactly what allowed me to support myself without depending on anyone. As the months turned into years, the difference between our paths continued growing wider. Jason's lifestyle became increasingly unpredictable, with stories about new partnerships, changing plans, and expensive purchases appearing in family conversations, while my life followed a steady rhythm of work, saving, and careful planning. Rented a modest apartment near the center of Denver, spent evenings studying ways to improve my career, and slowly created a sense of security that came from knowing every step forward was the result of my own effort. There were moments when I wondered if my parents would eventually recognize the value of that stability, but each time we spoke, the focus remained on Jason and the future they imagined for him. Eventually, I realized that waiting for their approval was only holding me back, so I made a quiet decision to stop measuring my progress through their expectations. Instead, I focused completely on building the life I wanted. Even if my family never fully understood the path I had chosen, I worked extra hours, accepted challenging projects, and continued learning new skills that strengthened my position at work. The effort was exhausting at times, but every achievement brought a sense of pride that no one else could take away. During those same years, occasional updates about Jason became less enthusiastic. The early excitement surrounding his ventures slowly turned into vague explanations about delays, changes, and unexpected setbacks. Relatives mentioned that some of the investments had not produced the results everyone hoped for, and that certain projects had ended quietly without the success my parents once predicted. Despite those signs, they continued supporting him emotionally and financially, believing that the next opportunity would finally bring the breakthrough they had always imagined for him. I listened to those stories with a mixture of concern and distance, because although Jason was still my brother, the decisions surrounding his life had been made long before my opinions mattered. The distance between us eventually became physical as well as emotional when my career advanced enough for me to move into a better apartment and begin planning long-term financial goals. The independence I had built felt like a new chapter in my life, one that was separate from the expectations and comparisons that once defined my place in the family. Yet, even as I focused on the future, a small part of me sensed that the story surrounding my parents' decision to give everything to Jason was far from finished, because the kind of risks he continued taking rarely remain hidden forever, and deep down I knew that one day the consequences of those choices would reach point where no one in the family could ignore them any longer. As the years continued passing, I became more comfortable with the life I had built for myself in Denver, the routines of work. Responsibility and independence created a quiet confidence that I had never felt during the years when my value seemed constantly compared to my brother's potential. My career continued growing slowly, but steadily, and the financial stability I had worked so hard to achieve began giving me a sense of security that allowed me to think about the future in new ways. During this time, my contact with my parents became less frequent, not because of anger but because the distance between our lives had naturally widened. Our conversations were usually brief updates about everyday events, and although Jason's name still appeared often, the tone surrounding his story had started to change in subtle ways. Relatives occasionally mentioned that several of his business ventures had not developed the way he originally promised. The investments that once sounded exciting were now described with uncertainty, and the confidence my parents once expressed about his plans had slowly begun turning into quiet concern. However, they still defended him whenever questions appeared, explaining that success requires patience and that setbacks are part of any ambitious journey. I listened to these updates calmly, without offering judgment, because my own life had moved far beyond the need to prove anything to anyone. Each day, I focused on improving my work, expanding my knowledge, and maintaining the stability I had built through years of effort. The independence that once felt lonely had now become a source of pride, because every achievement represented something I had created without relying on the support that had once been reserved almost entirely for my brother. Meanwhile, the stories about Jason continued becoming more complicated over time. Some relatives explained that the businesses he had started either failed to grow or quietly disappeared after initial excitement. Others hinted that certain investments had been made without careful planning, which caused large portions of the money our parents had given him to disappear much faster than expected. Although these details were rarely discussed openly, the pattern became clear enough for anyone paying attention. My parents, who once believed they had secured the future of the family through Jason opportunities, were now facing the reality that many of those opportunities had never been as stable as they appeared from the outside. Despite these developments, I remained focused on my own path, because I understood that the choices made years earlier were never truly mine to control. I continued working, building savings, and planning long-term goals that reflected the careful approach I had always taken toward life. The calm rhythm of my days helped me realize that the stability I created for myself was something valuable, even if it had never been celebrated within the family. The turning point arrived unexpectedly. One quiet evening after I returned home from work, the air outside carried the cool mountain breeze that often moves through Denver after sunset, and I was preparing dinner while reviewing notes for a project I planned to present at work later that week. My phone rested on the kitchen counter, and for a moment the peaceful routine of the evening felt exactly like the life I had worked so hard to build. Then the screen lit up with a message notification. The name that appeared surprised me, because it had been a long time since I last heard from them directly. It was my parents. The message itself was brief, but the tone felt very different from the confident updates they once shared. It asked if we could talk soon about something important. There was no mention of Jason or any explanation about the reason for reaching out, but the unusual seriousness of the message immediately created a quiet sense of anticipation in my mind. For years, our communication had remained distant, polite, and predictable, yet something about this message suggested that the situation within the family had reached a point where silence was no longer possible. As I stood there in the quiet kitchen reading those words again, I realized that the story surrounding my parents' decision to give everything to Jason had finally reached the moment when the consequences of those choices were beginning to surface, and whatever they needed to tell me next would likely reveal just how much had changed since the day they placed all their trust in my brother's future. The message from my parents stayed in my mind long after I first read it, because the tone felt different from anything they had sent before. During the years when our Conversations were brief and distant. There had never been a sense of urgency or vulnerability in their words, but now something about that simple request to talk suggested that circumstances had changed in ways they could no longer ignore. The next evening, after finishing work, I finally called them, and as the conversation began, the calm confidence I once heard whenever they spoke about Jason plans had been replaced by a quiet heaviness that immediately revealed how serious the situation had become. They explained slowly that the opportunities they once believed would secure the future of the family had not developed the way anyone expected. Several of the businesses Jason invested in had failed to grow, and the money that once seemed like a powerful foundation had gradually disappeared through risky decisions and poor planning. What shocked me most was hearing that the savings and property they had trusted him with were now mostly gone. The years of support and belief they poured into his ambitions had left them in a position they never imagined. Facing my parents, who once felt certain that Jason would build something extraordinary, were now struggling with financial uncertainty that affected their own stability. As they continued explaining the details, I realized how much their perspective had shifted. The pride and excitement that once surrounded my brother's plans had turned into regret and confusion. They admitted that they never expected things to unfold this way, and that they had placed too much faith in the idea that potential alone could guarantee success. While listening to them, I felt a mixture of emotions. Part of me was saddened by the reality they were facing, because despite everything they were still my parents. Yet another part of me remembered the years when my own efforts had been quietly dismissed. While nearly everything was given to Jason without hesitation, they eventually explained that their reason for contacting me was simple: they needed help. The daughter whose independence they once questioned had now become the most stable person in the family. My careful choices, steady career, and financial responsibility had created a life that stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty they were now experiencing. Hearing them acknowledge this truth felt strange, because it was the first time they openly recognized the value of the path I had chosen years earlier when I moved away and built my life without relying on their support. The conversation that followed was calm but heavy with reflection. They spoke about how their belief in Jason potential had blinded them to the importance of balance and responsibility, and how they wished they had supported both of their children more equally during those earlier years. I listened quietly, because the past could not be rewritten, and the only question that mattered now was how I would respond to their request for help. After we ended the call, I spent a long time thinking about everything they had shared. The apartment around me was quiet, and the city lights outside the window reflected the stability I had created through patience and hard work. Part of me felt compassion, because watching parents face the consequences of difficult choices is never easy, but another part of me understood that helping them blindly could repeat the same cycle that had allowed Jason irresponsible decisions to continue for so long. The years I spent building my independence taught me the value of boundaries and responsibility, and whatever decision I made now would need to respect both of those lessons. As the night grew later, I realized that this moment represented more than just a request for financial help. It was the point where the roles within our family had completely changed. The daughter who once stood quietly in the background had become the one holding the stability everyone else now needed, and the choice I made next would determine whether the future of our family would finally be built on responsibility rather than the illusions that once gave everything to my brother. Without question, after the long conversation with my parents and the quiet night of reflection that followed, I realized that the decision I was about to make carried more meaning than simply helping them through a difficult financial situation. It represented the moment when I had to define the boundaries of my own life and determine how the future of our family would move forward. The years I spent building independence in Denver had taught me that stability does not appear suddenly. It grows slowly through responsibility, discipline, and careful choices. And because of those lessons, I understood that helping my parents could not mean repeating the same patterns that once allowed Jason to avoid the consequences of his decisions. The next time we spoke, I approached the conversation calmly, explaining that I cared about their well-being and wanted them to regain a sense of security, but that any support I offered would need to follow clear limits that protected the stability I had worked so hard to create. I began helping them review their remaining finances, encouraging them to organize their expenses and rebuild a foundation that focused on practical solutions rather than risky opportunities. This process required patience because the shift from the hopeful optimism once placed in Jason ambitions to the realistic planning now required for their future was not easy for them to accept. However, as the weeks passed, they slowly began understanding that responsibility and stability were not restrictions but protections that could prevent the same mistakes from happening again. During this time, Jason also remained part of the conversation, although his situation was far more complicated. The resources he once controlled had disappeared, and many of the ventures he pursued had left him without the success he expected. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the consequences of choices made without careful planning. My support for our parents did not extend into rescuing him from those consequences, because doing so would only repeat the cycle that had created the problem in the first place. Instead, I encouraged him to begin rebuilding his own life through work, responsibility, and realistic goals, the same path I had followed when I left home years earlier. At first, this approach created tension within the family because everyone had grown used to the idea that problems could be solved by providing more resources. Yet over time, something unexpected began happening. My parents gradually started recognizing the difference between the life Jason had attempted to build through shortcuts and the life I had created through patience and discipline. They spoke more openly about how they once misunderstood the value of consistency and how they now saw the strength that existed in the quiet progress I had made over the years. Those acknowledgments did not erase the past, but they did create a new kind of respect that had never existed between us before. Family visits slowly became less uncomfortable and more reflective because the conversations were no longer centered around comparisons or expectations. Instead, they focused on rebuilding trust and understanding the lessons that had emerged from everything we experienced. My parents began living more modestly while appreciating the stability they were working to regain. Jason also started taking small steps toward responsibility, accepting work opportunities that once seemed too ordinary for the ambitious plans he once described. Watching these changes unfold reminded me that sometimes the most powerful form of karma does not arrive through sudden dramatic events, but through the quiet realization that every decision eventually shapes the future we must live with. The years when everything was given to my brother had once made me feel invisible within my own family, yet those same years had also pushed me to build independence, strength, and discipline that no one could take away. In the end, the daughter who received the least support became the one capable of guiding the family toward a more balanced future. And although the path that brought us to this moment was filled with difficult lessons, it ultimately revealed something important: respect and stability are never created by favoritism. They are built through responsibility, patience, and the courage to choose a better direction when the past finally catches up with the present.